Pollination is a little more specific than just the transfer of pollen between plants. For pollination to occur, pollen from the anther of an angiosperm needs to be transferred to the stigma of an angiosperm of the same species. So when pollen is transferred between different species, or if it gets to a flower but not on the stigma, pollination has not occurred. Some plants can actually reproduce asexually by pollinating themselves, but many plants have evolved ways to avoid this happening to increase their genetic diversity. Like the gymnosperms, some angiosperms rely on the wind to disperse their pollen. But as we talked about, this is not the most efficient system. They need to produce huge amounts of pollen, and most of it winds up in the wrong place. So instead, most angiosperms rely on animal pollinators. Instead of relying on the wind and chance, angiosperms take advantage of animals that are traveling from flower to flower to carry their pollen where it needs to go. But the cost is that these animal-pollinated plants need to give those animals a reason to visit them. They do this by bribing them with food, known as floral rewards. Floral rewards are usually pollen and/or nectar. But of course, this costs the plant energy. Pollen is very high in protein, and nectar is high in sugar. So plants want to find a balance between attracting enough of the right pollinators and conserving their resources. Because insects and other pollinators want to maximize their food gathering, and plants want to maximize their pollination while conserving resources, very close relationships have evolved between plants and their pollinators over thousands of years. Here is a really interesting example. Charles Darwin received a specimen of this orchid that has an extremely long nectary, so the nectar is way down at the bottom of this long tube. Since nectar is produced to attract pollinators, Darwin hypothesized that the orchid must be pollinated by an insect with a very long tongue that could reach the bottom of that nectary. He never found the insect himself, but after his death it was discovered that the pollinator for this orchid is a hawk moth with a tongue that is almost a foot long. Now pause the video to answer this question. If you think back to our definition of pollination, it says nothing about fertilization. Pollination is just the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Just because pollination occurs does not necessarily mean there will be fertilization. Fertilization doesn't occur until the reproductive cells, or gametes, actually fuse to form a zygote. Angiosperm fertilization and reproduction is not that different from that of gymnosperms, but there are some different steps. The adult plants are diploid and produce haploid pollen and eggs. First, we have pollination, where the pollen containing male gametes is received by the stigma. Once the pollen is recognized by the stigma, it starts to grow a tube down the style of the carpel. Eventually, that pollen tube reaches the ovary, which contains the ovules, or female gametes. Once the pollen tube reaches the ovules, sperm are released and travel down the pollen tube. The haploid sperm fertilizes the haploid ovule, resulting in a diploid zygote. The zygote then develops into a seed with an endosperm, which can now germinate into a new diploid plant. Because plants are sessile and can't move around, they need other ways to expand into new areas. There are many different strategies plants use to disperse their seeds. Some take advantage of the wind. Often these seeds have tufts like dandelion seeds, or the wings on maple helicopters to help them catch the wind and be carried away from their mother plant. Others hitch a ride on or inside animals. Hitchhikers or burdocks have spines that help them stick to animals or humans as they pass by. Then later they fall off or are groomed off in a new area. Other plants produce fruits that are enticing to animals, and the seeds actually pass through the animal and then are deposited with a nice little store of compost somewhere else. Other plants have seeds that are carried in water. Usually these are large and hollow like coconuts. We mentioned that some plants produce edible fruits to help spread their seeds. But what actually is a fruit? You hear people debate often whether certain foods like tomatoes are fruits or vegetables. Well, the botanical definition of a fruit is the ripened ovary of a flower. So anything that is actually the ovary of a flower is a fruit. And yes, tomatoes are fruits, but so are cucumbers. When we think of fruits, we usually picture fleshy, sugary fruits. However, the definition of fruit is much broader than that. Because a fruit is a ripened plant ovary, not all fruits are fleshy. The seed pod of a milkweed plant develops from the ovary, so it is technically also a fruit.